So one of the worst times was when Doug went through what we called his AIDS phase. He became obsessed with the AIDS disease. This was in the 80s. And we had friends that were legitimately affected by AIDS, and it was a tragedy. But we weren't really part of that cohort that was really in the middle of it. But nonetheless, Doug would become neurotic about AIDS. He would call up the free clinic and he would say, I think I have AIDS. Please help me. What can I do? And, they would try to talk to him. They were generally concerned and they would say, why do you think you have AIDS? I said, I have this cold. It won't go away. And then they'd ask him, well, all right, have you ever had unprotected sex? And he would say, no. And then they would ask him, well, do you shoot up drugs? Have you ever used IV drugs? And he'd say, no. And then they ask him, well, have you ever had a blood transfusion? He said, no. And then, they'd say, well, then you don't have AIDS. You have a cold. But he'd still insist. He'd say, no, I know I have AIDS. I'm being punished. It's terrible. And they'd get disgusted. They have real tragedies to deal with. So they'd hang up on him. And and they would just make him even more sad. But he eventually got over that. But he would still rant about, like one of his obsessions was, why was AIDS called AIDS? And he would go on about this. He would say, all right, there's this group of doctors, they're contemplating AIDS. They figure, here's a disease, it's fatal, it's a death sentence, it's horrible and terrifying, it's debilitating and painful, and it affects people that we marginalize mostly. So what should we call it?
I know. Let's call it AIDS.
And he would go on about that. And, you think about it, he has a bit of a point, because the word aid is supposed to mean help, right? Like navigational aids, aid station, marital aids, role aids, and then confuses everyone. You probably remember that there was a diet product called AIDS. They were these little chocolate caramels that you would eat instead of food. They make you less hungry. They probably had stimulants in them. Oh, God, think about what would happen if kids got a hold of them. But they were a diet thing, and they had these commercials they would get on the radio. And
only the AIDS diet plan allows you to taste, chew, and enjoy.
Well, then, of course, the bad AIDS comes along, and all of a sudden you've got worst trademark ever. And he would still continue to go on about this. And he said, well, we know it comes from the HIV virus, right? So why don't we just call it HIVD? And then, some asshole in our group would say, yeah, then they can make commercials that say, hi, VD. At which point, we tell Doug, that's probably not a good idea after all.